The floor of the great hall went silent the moment the bond snapped into place. Alara Winters felt it before she understood it, a hot thread pulling tight behind her ribs, yanking her forward, as if an invisible hand had reached into her chest and closed a fist around her heart. She stumbled a step toward the raised platform, where Damien Ashgrove stood in his ceremonial black coat, his eyes wide with a shock that quickly hardened into something colder. 300 pack members turned to look at her. She had come to the moon ceremony only because attendance was required of every member, low rank or high. She had expected to stand at the back, near the doors, and watch as some daughter of a council family was named the mate of the new Alpha King. She had not expected the moonlight pouring through the vaulted windows to catch fire in her blood the instant Damien's gaze crossed the room and locked onto hers. The mate bond did not ask permission. It simply arrived, absolute and undeniable, and everyone in that hall who carried wolf blood felt it settle into the air like a change in weather. Damien's jaw tightened first. Alara watched the transformation happen in real time, the way his shoulders squared and his chin lifted, the way the warmth that had flickered for half a second in his eyes was smothered under something that looked almost like anger. "No," he said. The word cracked through the hall louder than it needed to be, amplified by silence and stone. "This is not possible." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Alara's twin sister, Hazel, gripped her arm from somewhere in the crowd behind her, though Alara barely registered the touch. Every part of her was fixed on the man at the front of the room, the Alpha King of the Ashgrove pack, the wolf whose lineage had ruled this territory for 4 generations, staring at her like she was a mistake the moon had made. Damien. His beta, a broad-shouldered man named Caleb, stepped half a pace closer to him, voice low, meant to be private and failing. "The bond does not lie. You know this." "I know what a king needs," Damien said, and though his voice dropped, it still carried, because every wolf in that hall had ears sharp enough to catch a whisper across a battlefield. "I need a mate who can stand beside a throne, not hide behind it." The words hit Alara like a slap she could not raise a hand to answer. She felt her wolf recoil inside her, curling into a smaller, wounded shape, as if trying to make itself invisible. She had never held rank in the pack. Her parents had been quiet, unassuming wolves who kept to the outer farms and never sought position, and Alara had grown up believing that was simply who she was, a girl from the edges, unremarkable and content to remain so. She had never imagined the moon would choose her for anything, least of all for him. "I reject this bond," Damien said, and this time his voice did not waver at all. He said it the way a man might announce the weather, flat and final, as though the words cost him nothing. "Before this pack, before the moon, I reject Alara Winters as my mate." The hall did not gasp so much as it seemed to inhale all at once and hold its breath. Rejection was rare. It was rarer still to hear it delivered in public, on the very night the bond was revealed, before the couple had exchanged a single word. Alara felt the thread behind her ribs go taut and then snap, and the pain of it doubled her over before she could stop herself. It was not only heartbreak, it was physical, a burn that raced down her spine and into her fingertips, the sensation of something vital being torn away before it had even fully arrived. She pressed a hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe, forced her spine to straighten, because 300 pairs of eyes were on her, and she refused, absolutely refused, to fall to her knees in front of all of them. "Alara," Hazel's whisper was frantic now, tugging at her sleeve. "Alara, we should go." But Alara did not move yet. She looked up at Damien Ashgrove, at the king who had just declared, in front of his entire pack, that she was not enough for him, and something in her chest that was not the mate bond, something older and steelier, began to burn instead. She had spent her whole life being overlooked. She had let herself believe that was simply the shape of her existence, that she would live quietly on the edges of packland and never be seen. But being overlooked and being publicly discarded were not the same wound, and standing there, in the wreckage of a bond that had lasted less than 60 seconds, Alara understood the difference with a clarity that felt almost like relief. She would not beg. She would not ask him to reconsider. She would not give him, or any of the whispering wolves around her, the satisfaction of watching her break. "Then it is done," Alara said. Her voice surprised her, steady and clear, carrying across the hall the same way his had. I would not want to be a burden to a king who cannot see past a title. A ripple of something new moved through the crowd this time, not quite shock, closer to interest. Damien's eyes narrowed, as if he had expected tears, or pleading, or silence, and had received none of those things. Alara, Caleb started, but she was already turning, already walking toward the doors at the back of the hall, her spine straight, her steps unhurried, refusing to run, even though every instinct in her screamed to. Hazel caught up to her in the corridor outside, breathless. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Alara admitted, and for the first time since the bond had snapped, her voice trembled, just slightly, just enough that only her sister could hear it. "But I am not staying here to be pitied." Behind the heavy doors, she could hear the ceremony resuming, the pack elders smoothing over the disruption, with practiced words, about the moon testing its kings, about how a rejection was rare, but not without precedent, about how the pack would move forward, as it always had. She could hear Damien's voice among them, low and controlled, already steering the room back toward order, back toward business, as if the girl he had just discarded were a minor inconvenience, already fading from memory. Alara walked faster. She did not go back to her small cottage on the outer farms that night. She went instead to the ridge above the northern fields, the place she had gone as a child whenever the world felt too loud. And she let her wolf take over, let the change ripple through her and carry her into the trees, running until the burn in her chest became the burn of exertion instead of grief. She ran until the moon dipped low and the eastern sky began to pale, and when she finally slowed, panting, at the edge of a stream she did not recognize, she realized she had crossed farther than she meant to, farther than she had ever gone in her life. She shifted back, human and shivering, and sat on a flat stone at the water's edge, staring at her own reflection in the current. The girl looking back at her seemed different already, though nothing about her face had changed. There was something new in her eyes, something that had not been there the day before. She thought of Damien's voice, flat and cold, declaring her insufficient before an entire hall of witnesses. She thought of the way his gaze had barely lingered on her before he decided what she was worth. "I will not be small again," she said aloud, to no one, to the water, to the fading stars. Not for him, not for anyone. It was not a promise she fully understood yet, not the shape it would take or the price it would cost her, but she felt it settle into her bones the way the bond had, permanent and undeniable. By the time the sun rose fully over the ridge, Alara Winters had already begun to plan the life she would build, far from the Ashgrove pack, far from the king who had rejected her before he had ever truly looked at her, and far, she told herself firmly, from the ache that still throbbed faintly behind her ribs, no matter how hard she tried to will it away. She did not yet know that 4 territories away, in the great hall she had just fled, Damien Ashgrove stood alone after the last of the pack had filed out, staring at the empty space where she had been standing, and that his own chest had begun to ache, in a way he did not yet have words for either. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a king did not need a mate to prove his strength, that the bond was an inconvenience the moon had thrown at him at the worst possible time, with rivals circling his territory, and his father's death still fresh enough that the throne beneath him still felt unfamiliar. He told himself many things that night, standing alone in the vast hall his ancestors had built, and none of them were enough to explain why sleep would not come, or why, when it finally did, he dreamed of gray eyes he had only looked into for a handful of seconds before he threw them away. In the morning, Caleb found him still awake, seated at the head of the long table where pack business was usually conducted, staring at nothing. "You should not have said it in front of everyone," Caleb said quietly, setting down a cup of something bitter and hot in front of his king. "A private word would have been enough." "It needed to be public," Damien said, though even to his own ears, the words sounded thinner than they had the night before. "The pack needed to see that I would not be led by sentiment." Caleb studied him for a long moment, the way he had studied him since they were boys, training together in the same yard, learning the same lessons about strength and weakness, and the terrible arithmetic of leadership. "And did it work?" Caleb asked. "Do you feel stronger this morning?" Damien did not answer. He only stared at the empty doorway at the far end of the hall, the one Alara Winters had walked through the night before, and said nothing at all, because the truth sitting heavy in his chest was not one he was ready to admit, not to Caleb, and not yet, though he did not know it, to himself. The road out of Ashgrove territory was longer than Alara remembered from the maps her father used to keep folded in the kitchen drawer, and by the third day of walking, she had stopped counting the miles and started counting the towns instead. Human towns, places where no one would recognize her face or know the shape of the story that clung to her like smoke. She reached the border of Larkwood territory on a gray afternoon, her boots worn thin, her stomach hollow, and stood for a long moment at the tree line before she found the courage to step across it. Larkwood was allied with no one, a small independent territory, known for taking in wolves who had nowhere else to go. And Alara had heard enough stories about it growing up to know it was not always kind to strangers. She was still standing at the edge of the trees, gathering her nerve, when a voice behind her made her jump. "You have been staring at that boundary marker for 20 minutes, the voice said, dry with amusement. "Either cross it or don't, but you are letting all the cold air in for the rest of us." Alara spun around to find a woman about her own age leaning against a fence post, arms crossed, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, watching her with an expression that was more curious than hostile. "I did not realize territory boundaries had temperature," Alara said, before she could stop herself. The woman laughed, short and surprised, as though she had not expected a stranger with hollow eyes and dust on her boots to have any wit left in her. "Fair point. I'm Sophie. You look like you have walked a long way to stand very still." "Alara," she said, and found she did not want to explain more than that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Sophie seemed to understand, or at least to sense that pressing further would not be welcome. She only nodded toward the cluster of low buildings visible past the trees. "There's a boarding house near the market square. Cheap, clean, and the owner does not ask questions she does not want honest answers to. You look like you could use both." It was, Alara would think later, the first small kindness anyone had offered her since the night of the ceremony, and she followed Sophie into Larkwood territory without another word, too tired to do anything but trust the pull of it. The boarding house was exactly as Sophie described, a narrow building with creaking floors, and a landlady named Grace, who took one look at Alara and asked no questions at all, only pointed her toward a room on the second floor, and told her breakfast was at 7 if she wanted it. That night, alone in a room that was not hers, in a territory that did not know her name or her failures, Alara lay awake and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened, now that there was no pack watching to see her break. She cried until her chest ached worse than the bond had, and then, sometime near dawn, she stopped, because crying had never once solved anything in her life, and she did not intend to let it start now. The next weeks blurred into a rhythm of small, deliberate choices. She took work at the market stalls first, hauling crates and stocking shelves for coin, because it required no history and no explanation. Sophie, it turned out, worked at a training yard on the edge of town, one of the few in Larkwood that accepted wolves without pack affiliation, teaching them to fight, to track, to hold their own in a world that did not automatically protect the unranked and unbonded. "You should come by," Sophie said one evening, finding Alara scrubbing crates behind the market stalls, long after the other workers had gone home. "You carry yourself like someone who has never been taught to throw a punch." "I have not," Alara admitted. "Then it is time you learned." Sophie's smile was not unkind, but it was not soft either. "Whatever happened to you before you crossed that boundary marker, it is not going to unhappen, because you scrub crates until your hands bleed, but you can decide what happens next." Alara thought about that sentence for 3 days, before she finally walked into the training yard. The man who ran it, a broad, weathered wolf named Noah who had fought in more territory disputes than he cared to count, looked her over with the practical eye of someone who had trained hundreds of hopeless beginners, and did not sugarcoat what he saw. "You are thin, untrained, and carrying something heavy on your shoulders that has nothing to do with muscle," he said. "It will take months before you are any good at this." "Then I will need months," Alara said. Something in her voice must have convinced him, because he nodded once, sharp and decisive, and put her to work that same afternoon. The training was brutal in a way nothing in her sheltered life on the Ashgrove farms had prepared her for. She fell more times than she could count in the first weeks, bruised her knees and knuckles, and went to bed most nights too sore to sleep properly. But there was something clarifying about the exhaustion, something that made the ache behind her ribs, the one that never fully disappeared, no matter how much time passed, feel smaller and more manageable by comparison. She learned to read an opponent's weight before they moved. She learned to fall without breaking. She learned, slowly, that her body was capable of far more than the timid life on the outer farms had ever asked of it, and each new skill felt like a small brick laid against the wall she was building around the girl who had once let a king's rejection define her. Sophie became something like a friend in those weeks, the kind who did not pry, but who was reliably present, who shared meals and complaints about difficult clients and, occasionally, quiet stories about her own past that made Alara understand she was not the only wolf in Larkwood who had arrived carrying invisible wounds. It was Sophie who first noticed the way Alara sometimes went still in the middle of a sentence, her hand pressing briefly against her chest, as though something inside her had tugged without warning. "Mate bond?" Sophie asked one evening, not unkindly, when she caught Alara doing it for the third time that week. Alara considered lying. She had not told anyone in Larkwood the full story, only the barest outline that she had left her old pack after a difficult ceremony. But something about Sophie's steady, unjudging expression made the truth easier to offer. "Rejected," Alara said, in front of the whole pack. Sophie's jaw tightened, the only sign of the anger Alara suspected she was holding back out of courtesy. That is a cruelty most kings do not stoop to, even the bad ones. "He is not a bad king, I think," Alara said, surprising herself with the fairness of it. "Just a proud one, proud enough to choose his pride over the moon's choice." "And you still feel the pull," Sophie said. It was not a question. Alara did not answer right away. She looked down at her bruised knuckles, at the calluses forming where there had once been only soft, untested skin, and thought about how strange it was that a bond built on rejection could still ache like a phantom limb, months after the wolf on the other end of it had cast her aside. "I feel it less every week," Alara said finally, which was not quite a lie, and not quite the truth either. "And one day I will not feel it at all." Sophie studied her for a long moment, then reached over and squeezed her shoulder, a brief, solid gesture of solidarity. "Until then, you keep training. A strong wolf does not wait around to feel whole again. She builds herself whole, with or without the bond." Alara held on to that advice like a lifeline in the weeks that followed, and slowly, without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, she began to feel less like a girl who had been discarded, and more like a woman who was choosing, deliberately and with her own two hands, the shape her life would take. She did not yet know how far that choice would carry her, or how soon the world she had left behind would come looking for her again. She only knew that for the first time since the night of the ceremony, when she fell asleep each evening in the narrow room above the boarding house, it was exhaustion that claimed her, and not grief. 6 months into her life in Larkwood, Alara no longer flinched when Noah threw a full-grown wolf her way in the training yard. She had learned to read the shift of weight in a shoulder before a strike came, to fall and roll instead of absorbing the full impact of a blow, to fight not with brute strength, which she still lacked compared to wolves who had trained since childhood, but with speed and precision that made up the difference. "You have a gift for finding the gap," Noah told her one afternoon, watching her circle a much larger sparring partner, without ever putting herself in the direct line of his strikes. "Most fighters look for the opening after it is already there. You look for where it is about to be." "I have had practice reading people who did not want to be read," Alara said, and left it at that. Her days had taken on a shape she had never imagined for herself, back on the Ashgrove farms. Mornings in the training yard, afternoons helping Sophie manage the growing list of unranked wolves who came through Larkwood looking for somewhere to belong, evenings spent poring over territory law and pack governance with a stack of borrowed books, because Alara had discovered, almost by accident, that she had a mind for structure and strategy that her old life had never given her the chance to use. It was Grace, the landlady who had never asked questions, who first suggested she put that mind to use beyond the boarding house ledgers Alara had taken to balancing in her spare time, unprompted, simply because the numbers had been wrong and it had bothered her not to fix them. "Larkwood's council is a mess," Grace said, one evening, setting a plate of food in front of Alara with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had run a business for 30 years without a single wasted motion. "Half of them cannot read a ledger, and the other half do not want to. You have an eye for it. You should offer your services. Elara laughed at first, certain the older woman was joking. But Grace was not a woman who joked about business, and within a month, Elara found herself sitting across a table from 3 members of Larkwood's ruling council, walking them through a set of trade proposals she had drafted late at night when sleep would not come. Proposals that would strengthen the territory's independence and reduce its reliance on larger, more dangerous neighboring pacts. The council listened. More than that, they implemented 2 of her suggestions within the season, and word began to travel, the way it always did in territories built on tight-knit communities, that the quiet newcomer who trained in Noah's yard had a mind sharp enough to reshape trade routes and a spine strong enough to hold her ground in rooms full of wolves twice her rank. It was during one such council meeting that Elara first met Felix. He arrived as an envoy from a neighboring territory, tall and easy-mannered, with the kind of confidence that came from genuine competence rather than inherited title. He was the second son of an alpha, not destined for a throne himself, and something about that fact seemed to have left him freer than most high-ranked wolves Elara had encountered, unburdened by the constant performance of authority. You are the one who redrew our trade terms so we stopped losing grain to Ashgrove's tariffs, Felix said, dropping into the seat beside her after the meeting adjourned, his tone more admiring than presumptuous. I have been trying to convince my own territory to do the same thing for 2 years. Ashgrove's tariffs are needlessly aggressive, Elara said, keeping her voice even at the mention of the name, though something in her chest tightened briefly. They assume every neighboring territory is either an ally or a threat, with no room for anything in between. You sound like you know the pack well, Felix observed, watching her with more attention than she was entirely comfortable with. I used to, Elara said, and did not elaborate. And Felix, to his credit, did not push. Over the following weeks, Felix found reasons to return to Larkwood more often than his official duties strictly required, and Elara found she did not mind his company. He was easy to talk to, quick with a joke that did not come at anyone's expense, and refreshingly uninterested in the kind of rigid hierarchy that had governed every interaction she had ever had within the Ashgrove pack. He asked her opinion, and genuinely seemed to want it. He treated her competence as a simple fact rather than a surprise. You could have a real position, you know, Felix told her one evening, as they walked along the market square after a council session had run late. Not just advising Larkwood's elders informally. A real seat. My territory would take you in a heartbeat if you ever wanted it. I am not looking for a seat, Elara said, though the offer settled somewhere warm in her chest, an acknowledgement of worth that felt entirely different from the way worth had once been assigned to her, or denied her, by a king who had looked at her for 60 seconds and decided she was not enough. What are you looking for then? Felix asked, and there was something careful in the question. Something that told her he already suspected the answer mattered to him more than he was letting on. Elara considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she had learned to turn over trade proposals and training strategies, examining it from every angle before committing to an answer. I am looking for a life I built myself, she said finally. One no one can take credit for, and no one can take away. Felix nodded slowly, as though this answer satisfied something in him, some test she had not known she was taking. Then I hope you find it, and I hope, when you do, there is room in it for someone who admires the woman building it. She did not answer that directly, but she did not pull away either when his hand brushed hers as they walked, and for the first time since the moon ceremony, Elara allowed herself to consider that her future might hold more than the careful, solitary rebuilding she had been doing for months. That night, alone in her room, she caught herself pressing a hand to her chest out of old habit, checking for the familiar ache of the broken bond, and found it fainter than it had been in weeks, though not entirely gone. She was not sure whether that faintness was a sign of healing, or simply a sign that she had gotten better at ignoring what she did not want to feel. Either way, she told herself, it no longer mattered as much as it once had. She had a life now that belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own hands, admired by people who had never once made her feel small. She had training that had turned her into someone capable of holding her own, a mind that Larkwood's council had come to genuinely value, and now, perhaps, the beginning of something with a man who looked at her like she was already whole. She did not know that 4 territories away, the king who had once looked at her for 60 seconds and found her wanting had, in recent weeks, begun asking Caleb quiet questions about a woman named Alara Winters, or that the questions had grown more frequent and more urgent as strange cracks had begun appearing in his own strength that no healer in his territory could explain. She did not know, and for now, walking home through the lantern-lit streets of a territory that had given her back her own name, she did not think to wonder. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after the moon ceremony, though Damien did not recognize it for what it was until much later. He was walking the eastern boundary line with Caleb, inspecting a fence the pack's builders had repaired after a storm, when a wave of dizziness struck him so hard he had to grip a post to keep from falling. It passed within seconds, but Caleb saw it happen, and the concern on his beta's face told Damien it had not gone unnoticed. "That is the 3rd time this week," Caleb said quietly, once they were alone again. "You should let the healer look at you." "It is nothing," Damien said, the way he had said it the previous 2 times. "Fatigue. The throne is heavier than I expected." But it was not fatigue, and both of them knew it, even if neither said so aloud. Damien had grown up hearing stories about what happened to alphas who rejected their fated mates, stories his father had told him as cautionary tales when he was young enough to still believe rejection was something that only happened to weaker wolves who lacked the discipline to master their own instincts. The bond was not merely emotional, it was a thread that reinforced a wolf's strength, sharpened his senses, steadied the reflexes that kept an alpha alive in a world full of rivals who would exploit any weakness they could find. Severing it, whether by choice or circumstance, left a wound that did not heal cleanly. The dizziness became more frequent as the weeks passed. His night vision, once sharp enough to track a rabbit through dense woodland in total darkness, began to dull at the edges. His temper, always carefully controlled, grew shorter, snapping at council members over matters that would once have barely registered as inconveniences. Worse than any of it were the visions. They came at night, uninvited, dragging him out of sleep with images that felt too vivid to be ordinary dreams. Gray eyes, a woman's steady voice, unbroken, even as her whole world collapsed around her. A hall full of silent witnesses to a cruelty he had delivered himself. He woke from these visions gasping, his heart pounding, an ache in his chest that no physician in his territory could explain, because it was not a wound of the body at all. "You need to see the pack healer," Caleb said again, weeks later, after finding Damien awake at his desk at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing, a cup of untouched tea gone cold beside him. "This is beyond stubbornness now, Damien. Something is genuinely wrong." Damien finally agreed, more out of exhaustion than conviction, and the healer, an elderly woman named Ivy who had served 3 generations of Ashgrove alphas, examined him with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had seen every kind of ailment a wolf's body could suffer. "There is nothing wrong with your body that I can treat with herbs or rest," Ivy told him finally, folding her hands in her lap and regarding him with an expression that held no pity, only a kind of tired honesty. "What ails you is the bond you severed, Damien. A rejected mate bond does not simply disappear. It leaves a wound, and wounds like that do not heal themselves, while the one who caused them refuses to acknowledge what he has done." "I acted in the pack's best interest," Damien said, though the words felt increasingly hollow each time he repeated them, worn thin from overuse. Ivy's expression did not change. "Did you? Or did you act in the interest of your own pride, and dress it in language the pack would accept?" Damien did not answer, because he did not trust himself to say something that would not reveal how close her words had cut. Ivy studied him a moment longer, then sighed, the sigh of a woman who had watched too many proud young alphas make the same mistake, and pay for it in the same slow, grinding way. "The strength you have lost will not return until the bond is either restored or fully released, and a bond is rarely fully released, while both parties still draw breath, and still, on some level, want it. I cannot fix this with medicine, Damien. Only you can fix it, and I suspect you already know how." Word of Damien's declining strength did not stay contained within the healer's quarters for long. Pack gossip moved faster than any messenger, and within a month, whispers had reached every corner of Ashgrove territory that their king was weakening, that his night vision had dulled, that his reflexes in the training yard had slowed enough for even mid-ranked wolves to land hits that would once have been impossible. It was exactly the kind of weakness a rival could not resist testing. Victor Ashford ruled the neighboring Ashford territory, A pack that had coexisted uneasily with Ashgrove for 2 generations, bound by treaties neither side had ever fully trusted. Victor had watched Damien's rise to power with the patient, calculating interest of a wolf who believed thrones were meant to be taken rather than inherited, and when rumors of the young king's weakening strength reached him, he began, quietly and methodically, to test the boundary lines. Small incursions first, a hunting party that strayed too far into Ashgrove land and claimed ignorance, a trade shipment delayed at the border under flimsy pretenses, nothing large enough to justify open conflict, but each incident calculated to probe how sharply, or how sluggishly, Damien would respond. Damien felt the pressure of it building, even as his own body continued to fail him in small, humiliating ways. He stood at council meetings and found his concentration fraying. He led hunting parties, and found himself half a step slower than the wolves he was supposed to be leading. Caleb covered for him where he could, but even Caleb's loyalty could not disguise a king who no longer moved through his own territory with the certainty he once had. "You cannot keep pretending this will resolve itself," Caleb said one evening, after another tense council session in which Damien had lost his temper over a minor procedural dispute that should never have escalated as far as it had. "Ivy told you what this is. The pack is starting to notice, and Victor Ashford notices everything. What would you have me do, Caleb?" Damien's voice came out sharper than he intended, frustration, and something closer to fear bleeding into it despite his best efforts to control it. "Chase down a woman I rejected in front of the entire pack and beg her forgiveness? That would look like weakness too." "Weakness is what you already look like," Caleb said, quiet but unflinching. The kind of honesty only a lifelong friend could offer a king, without fear of the consequences. "The whole territory can see it, Damien. The only question is whether you are willing to do something about the actual cause, or whether you would rather keep losing strength, until Victor decides the cost of testing you outweighs the risk, and moves to take what he wants outright." Damien did not answer that night, but the words lodged themselves somewhere deep, alongside the visions of gray eyes that still greeted him nearly every time he closed his own. It was another 2 weeks before the first real crack in his resolve appeared, and it came not from Caleb's warnings or Ivy's honesty, but from something far simpler, a passing comment from a trade envoy who had recently returned from Larkwood territory, mentioning almost in passing that the small independent pack had been quietly thriving under a new set of trade reforms drafted, of all people, by a woman named Ilara. Damien had not spoken her name aloud since the night of the ceremony. Hearing someone else say it, casually, without any awareness of what it meant to him, felt like being struck. "Ilara," he repeated, and the envoy, oblivious to the weight in his king's voice, simply nodded and moved on to the next piece of trade news, never noticing that the man across the table from him had gone very still, his mind already 4 territories away, replaying a memory of gray eyes and a voice that had not broken, even when he had given her every reason to. After the envoy's careless mention of her name, Damien found it impossible to think of anything else. He told himself, at first, that his interest was purely strategic. Larkwood was a small, independent territory, but it had begun forming quiet trade partnerships with several packs along Ashgrove's western border, and any woman capable of drafting agreements that made a struggling territory suddenly competitive was worth understanding, regardless of who she happened to be. He told himself this so many times, over so many days, that he almost believed it. Then Caleb returned from a routine border inspection, with news that shattered the last of that pretense. "There is talk," Caleb said carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on unstable ground, "that Felix Hartley has been spending considerable time in Larkwood, more than his diplomatic duties require." Damien's hand tightened around the edge of the table, hard enough that the wood creaked beneath his grip. Felix Hartley, the Hartley territory's second son. The same. He has no claim to his own family's throne, which perhaps makes him freer to court whomever he chooses. Caleb watched his king's face carefully as he delivered this. "The rumors say he has taken quite an interest in Ilara Winters." The name, spoken so plainly, so publicly, in a sentence that placed it beside another man's name in the context of courtship, sent something through Damien that he did not have a polite word for. It was not quite anger. It was sharper than jealousy, though jealousy was certainly part of it. It felt, more than anything, like watching something he had thrown away, with his own 2 hands being picked up, admired, and treasured, by someone who understood its worth better than he ever had. He hated how much that thought unsettled him. He hated more that he could not stop thinking it. That night, the visions came harder than they had in weeks. Not just gray eyes now, but the memory of her voice, steady even as her whole world collapsed. Then I would not want to be a burden to a king who cannot see past a title. He woke before dawn, chest heaving, and found himself, for the first time since the ceremony, wondering not how to reclaim his strength, but how badly he had wronged the woman who had once been offered to him by the moon itself, and what it might mean that some part of him could not stop hoping she had not yet given her heart to someone else. He did not have long to sit with that realization before circumstances forced his hand entirely. 3 days later, a hunting party from Victor Ashford's territory crossed the border in force, not the small, deniable incursions of previous weeks, but a deliberate, sizable group that engaged an Ashgrove patrol directly. No lives were lost, but 2 of Damien's wolves were badly injured, and the message was unmistakable. Victor had grown bold enough to test Ashgrove's strength with real teeth, not merely probing fingers. Damien called an emergency council session that evening, his weakened reflexes and dulled senses more of a liability than ever, with open conflict now a real possibility. It was during this session that Grace, the eldest of his advisors, and a woman who had served the Ashgrove pack even longer than Ivy the healer, raised a suggestion that made the entire room go quiet. "There is precedent," Grace said carefully, "for territories facing external threats to seek treaty support from independent allies. Larkwood has grown surprisingly influential along the western trade routes in recent months. An alliance there would strengthen our position against Ashford considerably, and give us access to intelligence networks we currently lack." Damien felt the trap close around him even as the logic of it settled, undeniable, over the room. A treaty negotiation with Larkwood was not merely strategically sound. It was, given everything Caleb had just told him, very likely to place him directly across a negotiating table from the one woman he had spent the last 2 months trying, and failing, to stop thinking about. "You believe Larkwood's council would agree to such a treaty," Damien said, buying himself time to think, though his mind had already leapt ahead to the impossible prospect of standing in the same room as Alara Winters, for the first time since he had rejected her before 300 witnesses. "Larkwood benefits from Ashgrove's protection as much as we would benefit from their trade intelligence," Grace said. "It is a mutually favorable arrangement, if handled correctly." Caleb, who alone in the room understood the full weight of what Grace had just proposed, said nothing, only watched his king with an expression that offered no rescue, only quiet, unflinching support for whatever choice Damien made next. "Arrange it," Damien said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "I will lead the delegation myself." The council murmured its approval, already moving on to logistics, dates, the practical business of arranging a treaty negotiation, and none of them, save Caleb, seemed to notice the way their king's hands trembled slightly beneath the table, or understood that the prospect of facing Alara Winters again terrified him far more than any hunting party Victor Ashford could send across the border. That night, alone in his chambers, Damien found himself standing before a mirror he rarely bothered to look into, studying his own reflection with an unfamiliar, searching honesty. He thought of his father, who had died 2 years earlier after a long illness, and who had once told him, when Damien was still young enough to think thrones were built on strength alone, that a king who could not admit fault to himself would eventually be unable to admit it to anyone, and a king who could never admit fault was doomed to repeat every mistake his pride refused to let him see clearly. He had not understood the lesson then. He was beginning, painfully and much too late, to understand it now. He thought of Alara's voice again, steady and unbroken, and wondered, with a dread that felt entirely unfamiliar to a man who had never doubted his own authority, whether he would even recognize the woman he was about to face, or whether the girl he had wronged in that great hall had, in the months since, become someone entirely beyond his reach. He did not sleep again that night. He simply sat, staring at the door of his chambers, rehearsing words he was not yet brave enough to say, for a meeting that was still days away, and already felt, to him, like the most important battle he had ever prepared to fight. The council chamber in Larkwood had never hosted a delegation as large as the one that arrived from Ashgrove territory that morning, and Alara felt the shift in the air the moment the doors opened. She had been asked to sit in on the negotiations at Grace the landlady's insistence, alongside 2 members of Larkwood's ruling council, because her work drafting the territory's recent trade reforms had made her, whether she had sought the position or not, one of the few people in the room who fully understood the terms being proposed. She had agreed without hesitation, focused entirely on the substance of the treaty, the language of borders and intelligence sharing and mutual defense, and had not paused to ask which territory, exactly, was sending the delegation, until the doors swung open, and she saw him. Damien Ashgrove stood at the front of 6 wolves in traveling cloaks, and for one suspended moment, Ilara forgot entirely how to breathe. He looked different, thinner, somehow, despite the broad set of his shoulders, with shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there the last time she had seen his face, illuminated by moonlight in a hall full of witnesses to her humiliation. But his eyes found hers instantly, across the length of the room, and the recognition in them was so raw, so unguarded for the space of a single heartbeat, that Ilara had to look away first, unwilling to let anyone in the room see whatever expression had crossed her own face in response. "Alpha King Ashgrove," said Oren, the eldest of Larkwood's council members, rising to greet him with the careful formality territory politics required. "We are honored by your presence, though I confess we did not expect you to lead the delegation personally." "The matter concerns my territory's security directly," Damien said, and Ilara noted, with a strange, distant part of her mind that was still cataloging details, even as the rest of her reeled from his presence, that his voice had lost none of its command, even if his eyes looked tired, in a way she had never seen before. "I felt it warranted my attention." His gaze flicked briefly to her again as he took his seat, and this time she held it, refusing to be the one who looked away twice. Something in his expression flickered, surprise perhaps, or something closer to shame, and then the negotiations began in earnest, and there was no more room for anything but the careful, exhausting business of trade terms and border agreements. Ilara had expected, if she had allowed herself to imagine this moment at all in the months since she left Ashgrove territory, that she would feel shattered by his presence, undone by old wounds reopening. Instead, she found something steadier rising in her, an unexpected calm born of every hour she had spent in the training yard, every late night poring over governance texts, every small, deliberate brick she had laid in the foundation of the life she had built without him. She spoke when the negotiations required her expertise, laying out the logic of specific trade clauses with a precision that drew nods from her own counsel, and, she noticed, a flicker of something like admiration from more than one member of the Ashgrove delegation. She did not address Damien directly if she could help it, routing her points through Oren or through Caleb, whom she recognized from that terrible night, and who, she noted, watched her now with an expression far warmer than mere professional courtesy required. It was Damien who finally broke the pattern, near the end of the session, when a disputed clause regarding shared border patrols required direct clarification. "Miss Winters," he said, and her name in his voice, formal and careful, still landed somewhere beneath her ribs with more force than she wanted to admit. "Your proposed language here suggests joint patrols would operate under Larkwood's command structure during the first 6 months. May I ask the reasoning?" It was a fair question, professionally asked, and Ilara answered it the way she would have answered anyone else in the room, clearly and without hesitation. "Larkwood's patrol routes already account for the terrain irregularities along this section of the border. Ashgrove patrols unfamiliar with the ravines here would be at a tactical disadvantage during the adjustment period. The arrangement is temporary and reciprocal once your own patrols have mapped the terrain." Damien studied her for a long moment, long enough that Oren cleared his throat, gently signaling the negotiation should continue. But before it did, Damien said something that had nothing to do with border patrols at all. "That is a well-reasoned proposal," he said quietly. "You have grown considerably skilled in matters of territory strategy since—" He stopped himself, visibly, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air between them, heavier for what it did not say than for anything it might have. "Since I left your pack," Ilara finished for him, her voice even, giving nothing away, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she was certain every wolf in the room could hear it. "Yes, I have had considerable time to grow, Alpha King Ashgrove." The formality of the title, deployed deliberately, landed exactly as she intended it to. Something in his expression tightened, and for a moment, she thought she saw genuine pain flash across his features before he mastered it. nodding once and allowing the negotiation to continue without further comment. The session ran long into the afternoon, and by the time terms were finally agreed upon, pending final review by both territories' full councils, Elara felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with the substance of trade clauses and everything to do with the effort of maintaining her composure for 6 straight hours in the same room as a man whose rejection had once nearly broken her. She was gathering her papers, preparing to leave, before the delegation's farewell formalities dragged the encounter out any longer than necessary, when Caleb approached her, alone, his expression careful and kind, in a way that caught her off guard. "It is good to see you well, Elara," he said quietly, genuinely. "Whatever else has happened, I want you to know that." "Thank you, Caleb," she said, and found she meant it. He had never been unkind to her, even on the worst night of her life. "He has not been the same since you left," Caleb added, so quietly she almost missed it, glancing once toward the doorway where Damien was engaged in stiff, formal farewells with Oren and the rest of Larkwood's council. "I do not say that to burden you with anything. Only because I suspect you deserve to know the rejection cost him a great deal more than his pride." Elara did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, only nodded once and gathered the last of her papers, aware, without needing to look, that Damien's gaze had found her again from across the room, and had not looked away. She left the council chamber before he could approach her directly, walking quickly through Larkwood's evening streets toward the boarding house, her mind a chaotic tangle of thoughts she was not yet ready to examine closely. She had built an entire life in the months since that terrible night, a life with training and purpose, and the beginnings, perhaps, of something real with Felix, who had never once made her feel like she was standing on trial. And yet some traitorous part of her chest had ached, all afternoon, with something dangerously close to longing, the moment Damien Ashgrove had looked at her from across that negotiating table, and she had seen, unmistakably, that whatever had once existed between them had not died as completely as she had spent 6 months trying to convince herself it had. Damien did not sleep at all the night after the treaty negotiations, and by dawn he had made a decision that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. He would not return to Ashgrove territory with the rest of the delegation the following morning. He told Caleb this over a cold breakfast in their shared quarters at the inn Larkwood's council had arranged, and his beta, to his credit, did not look particularly surprised. "You intend to stay behind," Caleb said, not quite a question. "I intend to speak with her. Properly, not across a negotiating table with an audience of council members." Damien pushed his untouched plate aside, unable to stomach anything. "I owe her that much, whatever comes of it. And Ashford's pressure on the border? The council will expect you back within the week." "The border will hold 3 more days without me," Damien said, though the admission cost him something, an acknowledgement that his territory's stability could no longer depend entirely on his uninterrupted presence, not when the wound at the center of his own strength remained unhealed. "This cannot wait any longer, Caleb. I have waited 6 months too long already." Caleb studied him for a long moment, then set down his own cup and spoke with the bluntness only a lifelong friend could risk. "You understand she may not want to hear anything you have to say. She built a life here without you, Damien. A good one, from what I have seen. You cannot simply arrive at her door and expect her to hand it back to you, because you have finally decided the throne is not worth more than she is." "I do not expect anything," Damien said quietly. "I only know that I cannot keep pretending this will heal itself, and I cannot keep pretending my pride was worth what it cost both of us." He spent that morning walking the streets of Larkwood alone, turning over words he had rehearsed a dozen different ways, and discarded each time as insufficient, inadequate to the size of the apology he owed. He thought of his father again, of the lesson about pride he had understood too late, and of Ivy the healer's blunt assessment that only he could fix the wound he had caused. He found himself, by mid-afternoon, standing outside the training yard on the edge of town, drawn there by instinct more than any specific plan, and it was through the open fence that he first saw her again, unaware of his presence, moving through a sparring drill with a focus and precision that stole the breath from his lungs. She was extraordinary. He had known, intellectually, from the negotiation the day before, that she had grown skilled in matters of governance and strategy. But watching her now, moving with a controlled, deliberate grace that spoke of hundreds of hours of discipline he had never once given her the chance to develop within his own pack's rigid hierarchy, Damien felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the wound the bond had left behind. She was not the quiet, overlooked girl from the outer farms anymore. She had built herself, brick by deliberate brick, into someone formidable, and she had done it entirely without him, in spite of him, because of the very cruelty he had inflicted on her. The realization should have comforted him, perhaps. Instead, it filled him with a grief so sharp it nearly drove him to his knees. Grief for every version of the life they might have built together, if he had simply looked at her that night and seen what the moon had already known, instead of letting his pride decide her worth in 60 catastrophic seconds. Noah, the yard's owner, noticed him first, calling a halt to the sparring session with a sharp whistle. Alara turned, breathing hard from exertion, and went very still when she saw who stood at the fence. "Give us a moment," Noah said to the rest of the yard, and though several curious glances lingered, the wolves dispersed, leaving Alara and Damien facing each other across a stretch of packed dirt that felt, to Damien, far wider than it looked. "You should have returned to Ashgrove with your delegation," Alara said, once the yard had emptied enough for privacy. Her voice was steady, guarded, nothing like the raw wound it had carried the night he last spoke to her. "I could not leave without saying what I came to say," Damien said. "May I have a few minutes of your time?" Alara studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing the request, could see the version of herself that might once have refused, simply out of self-protection, and the newer, stronger version that no longer feared a single conversation could undo what she had built. "A few minutes," she agreed finally, gesturing toward a bench at the edge of the yard. They sat, not close, a careful distance between them that felt, to Damien, like the physical shape of everything he had broken. "I have spent 6 months trying to convince myself I did the right thing," Damien began, the words coming slower and less rehearsed than he had planned, because facing her directly stripped away every careful phrase he had constructed the night before. That rejecting the bond in front of the pack was strength, not cowardice. That a king could not afford sentiment, that the moon's choice was not the same as wisdom. "And now?" Alara asked, her expression unreadable. "Now I understand that everything I called strength was only fear, wearing a crown," Damien said. "I was afraid of what it meant to need someone. My father died believing that admitting fault was the one weakness a king could never survive, and I built my entire understanding of leadership around never letting anyone, including myself, see me falter. When the bond named you, I did not see a woman worth honoring. I saw a vulnerability I could not control, and I destroyed it before it could destroy me. I was wrong, Alara, not wrong in some small, forgivable way, wrong in a way that cost you your home, your dignity, in front of everyone who was supposed to protect you instead." Alara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some point past his shoulder, and Damien forced himself not to fill the silence, forced himself to let her sit with the weight of what he had finally said. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less steady. "It was not the rejection itself. Rejections happen. The bond does not always align with what people want, and I could have understood that, eventually, if you had simply told me privately, with some measure of kindness. What I could not forgive, for a long time, was that you made my worth a public spectacle. You did not just reject me, you humiliated me, deliberately, in front of everyone I had ever known, because you needed the pack to see how little I mattered to you." "I know," Damien said, and the admission cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. "I have no defense for it. I can only tell you that I understand now, far too late, exactly how much it cost, and that I would give almost anything to undo it." "Almost anything," Alara repeated, something sharp entering her voice for the first time. "Except your pride, apparently, since you found 6 months to sit with your regret before you finally came looking for me." "I was a coward," Damien admitted. "I am still afraid, Alara. I am terrified that whatever I say now will not be enough, that I have already lost something I do not know how to earn back. But I could not let another day pass pretending that fear was a good enough reason to stay silent." Alara rose from the bench, putting a few more feet of distance between them, and when she turned back to face him, her eyes were bright with an emotion he could not fully name, something between anger and grief, and a longing she seemed determined not to show him fully. "I need time, Damien," she said. You do not get to arrive after 6 months and expect an apology, however genuine, to erase what happened. I built a life here. I have people who value me, who never once made me feel like I needed to prove I was enough for them. I will not throw that away, because you have finally decided I am worth the trouble. I am not asking you to throw anything away, Damien said quietly. I am only asking for the chance to prove, over time, that I have changed, however long that takes. Alara studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, though her guard did not fully drop. That is all you get from me today, she said finally. A promise to think about it, nothing more. It was not the answer he had hoped for, but it was, he understood, as he watched her walk back across the training yard, far more than he had any right to expect, and infinitely more than he deserved. Alara did not sleep well that night, or the night after, turning Damien's words over in her mind, until they lost all their shape and became simply a weight she carried through her days, without quite knowing what to do with it. She told Sophie everything 2 days later, unable to hold the tangled mess of it inside herself any longer, and Sophie listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through disbelief and anger and, finally, something more thoughtful, as Alara finished recounting the conversation on the training yard bench. What do you want to do? Sophie asked, when Alara finally fell silent. I do not know, Alara admitted. 6 months ago, if you had told me he would come here, humbled, and admit everything he did wrong, I would have said it was impossible. Now that it has happened, I find I do not trust it. People do not change that completely in 6 months, do they? Some do, Sophie said carefully. Under the right pressure, with the right reasons. But you do not owe him the benefit of the doubt, just because he finally said the right words. Words are easy, Alara. You know that better than anyone. Actions take longer to prove. It was Felix who complicated matters further, arriving in Larkwood 3 days after Damien's visit, for what he claimed was a routine diplomatic follow-up, but which Alara suspected, correctly, had more to do with rumors of the Ashgrove King's extended stay in town than any genuine trade business. I heard he came to see you, Felix said, finding her at the market square on a quiet afternoon, his usual easy humor noticeably absent. The whole territory is talking about it. He came to apologize, Alara said, choosing honesty over evasion, because Felix had never been anything but honest with her, and she owed him the same. For what happened at the ceremony? And did his apology satisfy 6 months of silence? Felix's voice was careful, not accusatory exactly, but Alara could hear the vulnerability underneath the composure he was clearly working hard to maintain. I do not know yet, Alara admitted. I told him I needed time. Felix nodded slowly, absorbing this, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened into something more resigned than angry. I have known for a while that whatever exists between you two did not simply end because he rejected the bond. I have watched you go still sometimes, mid-sentence, like something is pulling at you that has nothing to do with anything in front of you. I told myself it did not matter, that what we were building together was enough on its own. But I think, if I am honest, I always suspected this day might come. Felix, Alara started, but he held up a hand, gently, stopping her. You do not owe me an explanation, Alara. Whatever you decide, you built the life that made this decision possible, entirely on your own terms. And that is not something I would ever want to take credit for, or stand in the way of. I only ask that whatever you choose it because it is genuinely what you want, not because either of us is asking you to. It was, Alara thought later, one of the kindest and most difficult conversations she had ever had, and it left her with a clarity she had not expected. Felix had never made her feel small or lesser, but the ache that Damien's presence had reawakened in her chest was not something she could will away simply because Felix was, in every practical sense, the safer and kinder choice. She spent the following days in a strange, suspended state, training harder than usual in an attempt to outrun her own thoughts, drafting trade reports with unusual precision, as though careful, meticulous work could somehow settle the chaos underneath. Damien did not approach her again, keeping, she noted, the space she had asked for, though word reached her through Caleb, who had also stayed behind in Larkwood on unspecified diplomatic business, that the Ashgrove King's health had already begun to improve in the days since their conversation, his dizziness lessening, his sharpened senses slowly returning. The healer back home believes the improvement is tied to the honesty of the conversation itself, Caleb told her, when their paths crossed briefly outside the council chambers. Not to any promise you made him, because you made none. Simply to the fact that he finally faced what he had done, instead of burying it. That does not mean the wound is fully healed, Alara pointed out. No, Caleb agreed. But it is a start neither of us expected to see from him 6 months ago. It was Grace, the boarding house landlady, who had never once pried into Alara's history, but who seemed, somehow, to understand more than she let on, who finally offered the piece of advice that settled something in Alara's chest. You built this life because you refused to let one man's judgment decide your worth, Grace said one evening, setting a cup of tea in front of Alara at the boarding house kitchen table. That was the right choice, and nothing that happens next should undo it. But do not mistake caution for strength, child. A woman who is truly secure in her own worth does not have to punish a man forever to prove she has moved past what he did to her. She simply decides, clearly and on her own terms, what she wants next, and holds firm to that decision, regardless of what anyone else expects of her. And if what I want is complicated, Alara asked quietly, if some part of me is still angry, and another part still feels the pull of the bond, and I cannot fully separate the two, then you take your time deciding, exactly as you told him you would, Grace said simply. But you decide, eventually, based on what he does next, not merely on what he has said. Words cost a man nothing. Let him show you, over time, whether he has genuinely changed, or whether the crown will pull him back into the same old patterns the moment convenience allows it. Alara held on to that advice in the days that followed, watching from a careful distance as Damien, still lingering in Larkwood on the pretense of finalizing treaty details he could easily have delegated to Caleb, quietly went about proving, in small and unglamorous ways, that Grace's warning had reached him too. He spent an afternoon helping Noah repair a section of the training yard fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, working alongside wolves who had no idea, at first, that the man in plain clothes hauling lumber was an alpha king. He sat through a tedious council session on grain distribution, without once pulling rank or losing patience, listening more than he spoke. He never once sought her out directly again, respecting the boundary she had drawn, even as she caught him, more than once, watching her from across a room with an expression of quiet, patient longing he made no effort to hide. She was still not certain, as the days stretched into a second week, exactly what she wanted. But she found, slowly, that the anger she had carried for 6 months was beginning to soften into something more complicated, something that made room, cautiously, for the possibility that the man who had once destroyed her in front of an entire pack might genuinely be capable of building something different, if she gave him the chance to prove it. She did not yet know that Victor Ashford's patience with Damien's extended absence had already run out, or that the crisis brewing along Ashgrove's eastern border would soon force every careful, cautious calculation she was making to be tested far sooner, and far more dangerously, than she had ever expected. The messenger arrived in Larkwood just after midnight, half collapsed from a hard run across 3 territories, his message urgent enough that Caleb woke Damien immediately, rather than waiting for morning. Victor Ashford has crossed the eastern border in force, the messenger gasped, still catching his breath. Not a raiding party this time, a full advance. They have taken the outpost at Cedar Hollow, and are pushing toward the pack house itself. The council is holding, but they need you, Alpha King. They need you now. Damien was already moving before the messenger finished speaking, pulling on his traveling gear with the swift, practiced efficiency of a wolf who had trained his whole life for exactly this kind of emergency, even if he had never truly believed, until this moment, that Victor would be bold enough to attempt an outright invasion. He waited until you were away, Caleb said grimly, already packing his own gear alongside his king. He knew your absence would leave the pack's defense weaker, and he knew you were too honorable to abandon the treaty negotiations here without good reason. He has been planning this for weeks. Then we ride within the hour, Damien said. Every moment we lose is a moment he gains ground. Word of the invasion spread through Larkwood's council quickly, and Alara, roused from sleep by Sophie pounding on her door with the news, felt her stomach drop with a fear she did not have time to examine closely. Larkwood has a mutual defense clause in the new treaty, Sophie said, already dressed. already moving toward the training yard, where Noah was rousing every capable fighter in town. The council has voted to honor it. We are sending support. I am going, Alara said, without a moment's hesitation, already reaching for her own gear. Alara, Sophie started, but stopped herself, seeing the resolve already fixed in her friend's expression. You do not owe Ashgrove anything personally. Whatever is between you and their king, this is not your fight. It became my fight the moment I helped draft that treaty, Alara said. And it is my fight, because good people I have come to respect will be in danger tonight, regardless of what happened between me and their king 6 months ago. I am not doing this for him, Sophie. I am doing this because it is right. It was, she realized even as she said it, entirely true, and something in that truth felt like the final, clean resolution of a question she had been circling for weeks without quite naming it. The combined force from Larkwood reached Ashgrove territory by dawn, exhausted from the hard ride but ready, and the scene that greeted them at the border was worse than the messenger's account had suggested. Victor's forces had pushed further than expected overnight, and the fighting along the eastern ridge had grown chaotic and brutal. Ashgrove wolves fighting to hold ground against a force that significantly outnumbered them. Alara found Damien near the front line, directing his depleted forces with a clarity and command that bore no trace of the weakened, uncertain man who had stood before her in the training yard weeks earlier. Whatever strength the healer had told him would only return through healing the wound of the broken bond, it seemed, at least in this moment of crisis, to have returned in full, sharpened rather than dulled by the desperation of the fight. You should not be here, Damien said, when he spotted her among the arriving Larkwood reinforcements, alarm flashing across his face, even as relief warred visibly against it. Larkwood honors its treaties, Alara said simply, already moving into position alongside Sophie and Noah, assessing the terrain with the tactical eye she had spent months sharpening. This is not about you, Damien. This is about doing what is right. There was no time for anything further. Victor's forces pressed the line hard through the morning, and Alara found herself fighting alongside wolves she had never met, drawing on every hour of training Noah had put her through, reading the shift of an opponent's weight before a strike came, finding the gap before it opened, exactly as she had learned to do in a training yard, 4 territories away from the pack she had once believed she would never see again. The turning point came near midday, when Victor himself, growing impatient with the stalemate, pushed forward personally to lead a final assault meant to break through Ashgrove's weakened center line. Damien met him there, and Alara, fighting nearby, watched with her heart in her throat as the two alphas clashed, Victor's confidence built on months of believing his rival too weakened to properly defend his own territory. He was wrong. Whatever strength had returned to Damien in the crucible of this fight, it was enough to meet Victor blow for blow, and when Victor finally overextended, driven by frustration at an opponent who refused to break as easily as expected, Damien was ready, forcing him back, with a decisive combination that ended, finally, with Victor pinned and forced to yield or face a killing blow he had no way to survive. Yield, Damien said, his voice carrying across the sudden, stunned silence that fell over the battlefield as both sides realized what had happened. Yield, and withdraw your forces from Ashgrove land permanently, or this ends here. Victor, breathing hard, humiliation and fury warring across his face, finally yielded, and the word rippled back through his forces like a physical thing, the invasion collapsing as quickly as it had begun, Ashford wolves withdrawing in disorganized retreat, as their alpha's defeat became undeniable. The battlefield fell into the exhausted, ragged quiet that followed any hard-won victory, wolves tending wounds, checking on packmates, the adrenaline of combat slowly draining into something closer to relief. Alara found herself standing at the edge of it all, blood on her hands that was not entirely her own, watching as Damien, still catching his breath from the fight, turned and scanned the crowd, until his eyes found hers. He crossed the distance between them without hesitation this time, and stopped close enough that she could see the exhaustion, and something rawer, something like disbelief, in his expression. You fought for my pack, he said, as though he still could not quite believe it. After everything. I fought because it was right, Alara said again, though her voice had softened slightly, the adrenaline of the battle loosening something in her chest that 6 months of careful guardedness had kept tightly sealed, not because of you. I know, Damien said. "But you were here. That matters more than I know how to say." Alara looked at him for a long moment, taking in the blood and the exhaustion and the raw, unguarded gratitude in his expression, and felt, for the first time since the night of the ceremony, that the ache behind her ribs was not entirely made of grief anymore. "We are not finished talking about this," she said finally. "But I think, perhaps, we should have that conversation somewhere that is not a battlefield." Something that looked almost like hope broke across Damien's exhausted face, and he nodded, not pressing for more, understanding, finally, after everything, that patience was the only currency that could rebuild what his pride had once so thoroughly destroyed. 3 weeks after the battle at the Eastern Ridge, the Ashgrove pack gathered once again in the same great hall, where Alara's rejection had once echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling, though this time the mood in the room bore no resemblance to that terrible night. Alara stood near the entrance, Sophie and Grace beside her for support, watching the hall fill with pack members who had, in the weeks since the battle, heard every version of the story that traveled through pack gossip, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, all of them building toward this single, deliberate ceremony that Damien had insisted on, with a conviction that left no room for argument. In the days following the victory over Victor Ashford's forces, Damien had not once pressured her for an answer, exactly as he promised. Instead, he had done precisely what Grace advised, proving himself, through consistent, unglamorous action, rather than grand declarations. He had traveled to Larkwood twice more, not to plead his case, but to help finalize the treaty terms properly, treating Alara as an equal negotiating partner, rather than a woman he was courting. He had written to her, plainly and without pressure, describing the slow work of repairing his pack's trust in his leadership after the crisis, the reforms he was implementing, to ensure no future alpha would ever again treat a mate bond as a political inconvenience to be discarded for the sake of appearances. It was Felix, in the end, who had helped her find clarity, arriving in Larkwood one final time, not to press his own case, but to offer, with a generosity of spirit that Alara would always remember with gratitude, his honest blessing. "I have watched you these past weeks," he told her, "and I think you already know your answer. You do not look at me the way you look at him, even when you are trying very hard not to look at him at all. That is not a failing on my part, Alara. It is simply the truth of the bond, and I would rather see you happy with your whole heart than have half of it out of obligation to me." She had cried, that evening, not from grief this time, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of finally allowing herself to want something, without guilt attached to the wanting. She had sent word to Damien a week later, agreeing to return to Ashgrove territory, not to resume the bond immediately, but to see, with her own eyes, whether the changes he described in his letters were real or merely words offered from a safe distance. What she found, over the following days, was a pack transformed in small but meaningful ways. A new council seat, created specifically to represent unranked and low-ranked members, whose voices had never before been heard in matters of governance. Ivy the healer given expanded authority to advise on pack policy rather than merely tend physical wounds. Caleb promoted to a formal position that gave him real power to challenge his king's decisions, rather than merely advise from the shadows. And Damien himself, humbled in ways that showed not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, daily practice of listening before deciding, of admitting uncertainty, instead of masking it with false authority, of treating Alara, whenever their paths crossed during her visits, with a patience and respect that never once slipped back into the careless entitlement that had once defined him. It had taken those 3 weeks, and countless long conversations, some difficult, some tender, before Alara finally told him, standing on the same ridge above the northern fields where she had once fled after the ceremony, that she was ready to try again. Not because the bond demanded it, but because she had watched him choose her, deliberately and repeatedly, in 100 small ways that no crown or title required of him. Now, standing at the entrance to the great hall for the second ceremony of her life, Alara felt none of the trembling uncertainty that had gripped her the first time. She felt, instead, a steady, grounded confidence built from every hour of training, every trade negotiation, every hard-won piece of the life she had built entirely on her own, before ever considering whether to let Damien back into it. The hall quieted as she walked the long aisle toward the platform where Damien stood waiting, dressed once more in his ceremonial coat, though this time his eyes held none of the cold calculation that had once made her humiliation possible. They held instead an open, unguarded vulnerability that every wolf in the hall could see plainly, a king choosing, with his whole pack as witness, to honor, rather than discard what the moon had offered him. 6 months ago, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, I stood in this very place and rejected the greatest gift the moon has ever offered me, because I was too afraid of what it meant to need someone as fully as I needed her. I called it strength. It was cowardice, dressed in a crown. He turned to face Alara directly, taking her hands in his, and continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. I cannot undo what that cost you. I can only promise, before this pack and before the moon itself, that I will spend the rest of my life proving I understand, now, what I failed to see then. That your strength does not diminish mine, Alara Winters. It completes it. You built a life that made every wolf in this territory, and beyond it, understand exactly what they lost when I let you walk away. I am asking you now, not as a king commanding a mate, but as a man humbled by everything you have taught me since, for the honor of standing beside you, as your equal, for as long as you will have me. Alara felt the old thread behind her ribs pull taut again, the same sensation from 6 months earlier, but this time it did not feel like a trap closing around her. It felt like coming home to something she had chosen, deliberately, with clear eyes and a heart that had healed enough to risk itself again. I accept, she said, her voice ringing clear through the hall, not because the moon chose you for me, but because you have spent every day since, proving you understand the difference between being chosen and earning the choice. The bond reformed between them, not with the violent, involuntary snap of the first ceremony, but with a warmth that spread slowly and steadily through her chest, chosen and welcomed rather than imposed, and the hall erupted into a celebration unlike anything Alara had ever witnessed. The same pack that had once watched her humiliation, now witnessing, with genuine joy, the moment their king finally became worthy of the mate the moon had given him. Later that evening, standing together on the balcony, overlooking the territory that would now, truly, be both their home, Damien took her hand and asked the question that had clearly been sitting with him since the ceremony ended. Do you forgive me? He asked quietly. Truly? Alara considered the question honestly, the way she had learned to consider everything, in the months since she left this pack, a broken, discarded girl, and returned to it, a woman who had built her own worth from nothing. I forgive you, she said finally, not because you deserve it simply for asking, but because I watched you earn it, one honest, humble day at a time. That is the only kind of forgiveness worth giving, Damien, and it is the only kind I would ever have accepted. He pulled her close, and for the first time since the moon had first named them mates in a hall full of silent witnesses, Alara Winters felt entirely, completely whole, standing not as a woman who had been chosen out of duty, but as one who had been chosen, fully and deliberately, by a king who had finally learned that true strength was never about standing alone.